Why was everyone laughing at him when all he had done was speak the truth? Leo kept his eyes on the scratched wood of his desk, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The laughter was sharp, cruel, the kind of sound that found its way beneath the skin and stayed there long after the noise had stopped. Mr. Harrison's voice carried above it all, smug and unrelenting, each word another blow. A Navy SEAL, your mother, Leo, that's the most absurd thing I've heard all year. The words twisted like a knife. The teacher didn't just dismiss the claim, he turned it into a performance. Around Leo, students smirked and whispered. Some didn't even know why they were laughing. It was contagious, a wave of ridicule that didn't need logic, only momentum. Leo clenched his fists under the desk, nails digging into his palms. He thought about speaking, about standing up and shouting the truth until every smirk vanished. But his throat locked, his chest tightened. He could hear his mother's voice in the back of his mind, measured, calm, deliberate. She had always said that silence could sometimes be the strongest response. But right now, it felt like silence was cowardice. Mr. Harrison leaned against the chalkboard, basking in the attention. Let be realistic, class. The Navy SEALs are the pinnacle of masculine strength. Men who can run for 100 miles, swim in frozen oceans, endure the unendurable. It is not. He paused, savoring the place for someone's quiet suburban mom who probably spends her days gardening. The laughter rose again, louder now, more confident, as if the room itself had chosen to side with the teacher. Leo bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood. He thought of his mother's hands, steady, scarred in places he was never supposed to ask about. He thought of how she could go utterly still, her presence almost disappearing when she focused on something in the distance. He thought of the night he had walked into the kitchen and found her standing in the dark, staring out the window, her posture rigid, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. But none of that mattered here. Not to them. To them, she was just a mom, ordinary, invisible. The bell finally screamed, a shrill mercy that broke the tension. Students spilled into the hall, still chuckling, still buzzing with the cruelty of the moment. Leo stayed in his seat, frozen, until the room emptied. When he finally walked home, the words followed him, echoing louder than the sound of his own footsteps. His mother was waiting in the kitchen, wiping down a counter that was already spotless. She looked up at him only once, her face calm, unreadable. He tried to hold it in, but the dam broke. The story poured out, the laughter, the insults, the shame that felt like it had burned into his skin. He expected her to flare up, to rage on his behalf, to storm into the school and demand an apology. But she did none of that. She listened, silent, motionless except for the small, steady movements of her hands as she folded a towel and placed it neatly on the counter. When he finished, when his voice finally cracked into silence, she looked at him with eyes that were clear and unshaken. Understood, she said. Just one word. Not loud, not dramatic, but it carried more weight than any speech. She turned, walking into the office that Leo had always known was off limits. A room with doors she rarely left open. He hovered in the hallway, watching as she picked up a satellite phone, old but functional, a relic of a past he didn't fully understand. She dialed a number without checking notes, each press of the keypad like muscle memory. "This is Echo," she said, her voice low, steady. "Requesting courtesy muster, affirmative. Location Northgate High School. Time 800 tomorrow. Full dress. Thank you." She ended the call and looked at him, not with a smile, not with anger, but with a calm certainty that steadied his breathing. "Get some rest, Leo. The truth has a way of making itself known." That night, Leo lay awake long after the house had gone silent. He thought of what she had said, of the strange code name she had used, Echo. He didn't understand what it meant, not fully, but he felt it in his chest, a weight that was both terrifying and reassuring. In the morning, something was coming, and the people who had laughed yesterday were going to see a truth they would never forget. Sleep never came easy that night. Leo lay in bed, staring at the faint glow of the street light bleeding through his curtains. The words replayed in his mind like a cruel recording on repeat, the laughter, the smirks, his teacher's voice dripping with arrogance. He shifted under the sheets, restless, replaying everything he wished he had said but didn't. She's more than you know. She's everything you can't even imagine. But he had said nothing. Across the hall, a faint strip of yellow light glowed beneath his mother's office door. Evelyn Reed was awake. She often was. Leo had grown used to the quiet hum of her late nights, though he never knew what she did behind that door. Tonight, though, the light seemed different, heavy, watchful. He sat up, swung his legs to the floor, and crept closer. The carpet muffled his steps until he was just outside her office. He knew he shouldn't look, but curiosity clawed at him. The door was open just a sliver, enough to reveal fragments of her silhouette. She wasn't sitting at her desk, staring at papers like he expected. She was standing in front of a metal case, one he'd seen her move once from the basement to this room but had never been allowed to ask about. The case was open now, and inside gleamed objects he didn't recognize, though they stirred something instinctual in him. A black metal, polished steel, insignias too precise to be decorative. His mother's hands moved with a precision that was unnerving. She checked, cleaned, and reassembled a weapon with movements so fluid it was almost like watching a pianist perform. Her expression was not nostalgic, nor bitter. It was focused, professional, deliberate. Leo's breath caught in his throat. He stepped back before she could see him, but even in the safety of his room, the image burned in his mind. His mom wasn't just his mom. Something about her, the scars, the silence, the strange call she'd made, it all began to thread together in his head. And then the fear crept in. What if she was serious? What if tomorrow morning people didn't laugh anymore, but something worse happened? What if she embarrassed herself in front of everyone? What if the whole school turned on them? He tossed and turned, battling shame, pride, fear, and a strange, stubborn spark of hope. By the time sleep finally dragged him under, It was already near dawn. Evelyn Reed hadn't intended to let her son see the edge of her past, but she wasn't careless either. She had lived too long with secrets not to sense when his presence lingered outside her office. She let him watch, just enough to stir questions he'd one day need answers for. When she finally closed the case, she didn't look at the clock. She didn't need to. Her body had been trained into rhythms of time no alarm could dictate. She moved into the kitchen, made coffee with the same precision as her field drills, and waited for the day to arrive. Her hands wrapped around the mug, and memories she normally kept locked away pressed against the surface of her mind. The desert sun baking against her skin. The bite of ocean water colder than bone. The faces of men she had led, of men she had buried. The moments of stillness in chaos, where one wrong decision meant not just death, but the failure of everything she had sworn to protect. They had called her Echo, not because she was loud, not because she wanted to be remembered, but because she carried with her the weight of every voice that had gone silent. Her job had been to make sure their sacrifice wasn't swallowed whole by the void, to be the echo of those who couldn't speak anymore. And now that call sign had left her lips again, after years of silence. Not because she wanted recognition, not because she wanted to prove herself to a classroom of children or a smug teacher, but because her son's honor had been mocked, and that was something she would not let stand. She had faced insurgents with bombs strapped to their chests. She had swum through waters knowing there were sharks below and enemies above. She had crawled through dirt and blood, carrying men twice her size on her shoulders. None of it had ever broken her resolve. But hearing the tremor in Leo's voice when he recounted his humiliation, that had cut deeper than anything else. By the time the sun cracked the horizon, the house was alive with quiet preparation. Evelyn moved with calm efficiency, making breakfast for Leo as if this were any other day. Scrambled eggs, toast, black coffee for herself, orange juice for him. Leo sat at the table, bleary-eyed, his chest tight with anticipation. He wanted to ask her what she had done last night, why she had used that strange phone, who she had called. But every time the words reached his lips, he swallowed them again. Finally, he broke the silence. "Mom, what's going to happen today?" Evelyn looked up from her coffee, her eyes steady. For a long moment she said nothing, just let the silence draw out until Leo squirmed. Then she set the mug down carefully. "The truth," she said simply, "will walk on its own legs." It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the only one she was going to give. Northgate High School had no idea what was coming. Teachers filtered in, groggy with coffee, trading weekend gossip in the faculty lounge. Students slammed lockers, shouted down hallways, and joked about the delusional kid whose mom was supposedly a SEAL. Mr. Harrison, as expected, was the loudest voice among them, retelling the story of yesterday's class with embellishments that made the laughter sharper, crueler. By 8 o'clock the day seemed normal, ordinary, forgettable. But then the sound began. It wasn't loud at first, more a vibration than a noise, a low hum that buzzed in the soles of shoes, in the glass of windows. Conversations stumbled, heads tilted. A few students pressed against the glass of their classroom windows, squinting toward the quad. The hum grew, became rhythm, became thunder. Hundreds of synchronized boots striking asphalt, not marching like a parade, sloppy and loud, but a cadence so precise, so absolute, that it was less sound and more inevitability. The first student to see them went pale, then another, then another. And by the time the faculty drifted toward the windows, silence had already swallowed the school. 200 men, immaculate in navy blue and white, marched onto the central lawn in perfect formation. They moved as one, stopped as one, stood as one. And in that stillness, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The sound didn't just fill the air, it commanded it. 200 boots struck the asphalt in flawless rhythm, a tide of precision that made even the birds in the trees fall silent. The quad, usually a mess of noise and chaos, was now frozen, a canvas on which discipline painted its strokes. Students pressed against windows, eyes wide, mouths open. Some recorded on their phones, hands trembling, their instincts telling them they were watching something bigger than themselves. Teachers peeked out of doors, their chatter silenced into wary confusion. Mr. Harrison stood in the faculty lounge, coffee cup halted halfway to his lips. His first instinct was denial. This had to be a prank, an elaborate joke. Seniors trying to make a statement. Nobody could assemble something like this without permission. Nobody could march like that unless. But no, it was impossible. His face flushed red, a mixture of anger and the creeping edge of fear. Out on the lawn, the column of men halted. A silence deeper than any noise followed, crushing in its weight. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe. And then Evelyn Reed arrived. There was no tactical vehicle, no government convoy. She didn't emerge from the back of a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. She pulled into the visitor parking lot in a 10-year-old station wagon, the kind that blended into any neighborhood. She stepped out wearing plain jeans, a gray sweater, and practical boots. Her hair was tied back simply. No uniform, no medals. If you didn't know better, you might think she was there for a parent-teacher conference. But the moment she began walking toward the quad, everything changed. The 200 men shifted, not visibly, not dramatically. No words were spoken, no orders barked, but a path opened, seamless and silent, as if the sea itself had parted for her. Evelyn Reed walked forward, unhurried, her posture calm, steady, unshakable. She didn't look at the crowd of students whispering, didn't glance at the teachers gathered on the steps, didn't acknowledge the gawking stares. Her eyes were fixed only on the men before her, and theirs were fixed only on her. Not a single one blinked. Not a single one faltered. It wasn't spectacle. It wasn't ceremony. It was instinct, deference, recognition, the kind of silent, unspoken respect that cannot be taught, only earned. Mr. Harrison burst from the administration building, face red, voice shrill. "Ma'am, ma'am, excuse me." He stormed across the grass, flailing his arms as if to block her path. "This is an unauthorized assembly. You are disrupting the educational environment. I demand to know what you think you're doing." Evelyn didn't look at him, not once. Her steps were measured, her gaze locked on the formation ahead. The shouting, the noise, the sputtering of a man trying to reassert control in a world that had just outgrown him. All of it dissolved like background static. When she reached the wall of uniforms, the men moved again, silently opening their ranks to let her pass. She walked through them as though she belonged there because she did. And for the first time, Leo saw it. Not just his mother, not just the quiet woman who folded towels with precision and stared out windows with unknowable thoughts. He saw Echo, the woman whose calm was forged in fire, whose silence was not weakness but command. At the edge of the quad, another figure stepped out onto the porch of the administration building. Principal Miller, retired Army colonel. His face was unreadable as his eyes scanned the scene. He didn't see a prank. He didn't see confusion. He saw recognition. The golden tridents pinned to their uniforms. The campaign ribbons. The almost invisible lapel pins marking operations that weren't supposed to exist. And then he saw Evelyn Reed. The way she stood, parade rest but natural, relaxed yet absolute. The way 200 of the world's most dangerous men gave her their full, unblinking attention. His heart tightened. He knew. He wasn't watching a mother defending her son. He wasn't watching a school spectacle. He was standing in the presence of a commander. Mr. Harrison hadn't yet realized his own peril. "This is absurd, completely unacceptable," he shouted, trying to make his voice cut through the quiet. "I demand you." "Mr. Harrison." Principal Miller's voice was calm, but sharp as a blade. He placed a firm hand on the teacher's shoulder. "I suggest you stop talking." The words cut deeper than any scream. Harrison froze, blinking, his anger collapsing into something smaller. Miller turned to face the quad, his voice steady but carrying the weight of command that came from decades in uniform. "For 20 years I served in the United States Army," he began, his tone carrying across the lawn without the need of a microphone. "I worked alongside operators from every branch in every shadow of the world. We tell ourselves we understand what that means. We read books. We watch movies. But the truth is, most of us have no idea." He gestured to the men standing in formation. "Do you know who these men are?" The students leaned forward. Teachers held their breath. "In that third rank stands Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne. He once held off 50 enemies alone for 6 hours to protect his wounded comrades. Navy Cross recipient." A ripple of awe moved through the crowd. "Over there, Lieutenant Commander James Reaper Gallo. His team conducted the highest altitude halo jump in combat history." Miller's voice carried like scripture. "And on the far right, Master Chief Petty Officer David Chun, one of the most decorated combat medics in the history of naval special warfare." He paused, letting the words hang. "These men are not props in a high school drama. They are legends, and they are here today for one reason." Miller turned to Evelyn, his eyes locked on hers, not with question but with reverence. Then he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and connected it to the school's outdoor projector. An image flickered onto the gymnasium wall, a heavily redacted military citation. The name was blacked out, but the code name remained. Echo. The words on the screen described an act of almost unimaginable bravery. A lone operator holding a compromised position against impossible odds, saving an entire team from certain death. Miller's voice trembled, not with weakness but with respect. This is the declassified summary of the Medal of Honor awarded to the commander of the unit these men served with. He turned, facing the sea of stunned students and teachers. That commander was known to them only as Echo. And then he looked at Evelyn Reed. Her real name, Miller said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence, is Evelyn Reed. The gasp that tore through the crowd wasn't just sound, it was the shattering of perception. Students clutched their mouths. Teachers stared. Phones dropped from trembling hands. Leo's breath caught in his chest. His vision blurred with tears he hadn't felt coming. His mom, his mother, the truth they had mocked yesterday now stood undeniable before them all. And for the first time in his life, Leo stood taller than he thought possible. The gym wall glowed with the redacted document, but no one cared about the blacked-out names. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the single word that blazed like a beacon through the smoke of disbelief. Echo. The silence was suffocating. Even the autumn wind, usually restless across the quad, seemed to pause, waiting. 200 seals stood motionless, their presence like a mountain dropped onto the school grounds. Evelyn Reed stood before them, calm as stone, her gray sweater stirring faintly in the air. And then, as if guided by one heartbeat, the formation moved. 200 arms snapped upward in unison. The salute cracked like thunder, a sound so sharp and synchronized it seemed to tear the air itself. It wasn't for the crowd. It wasn't for Principal Miller. It wasn't for history or recognition. It was for her. For Echo. Leo's throat tightened, his chest aching as if his ribs couldn't contain the rush of vindication surging through him. Just yesterday he'd been the fool in row 9, mocked for daring to speak the truth. Today, the same truth stood undeniable, saluted by legends. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't wipe them away. He wanted to feel this every second. Mr. Harrison, by contrast, looked like he'd been hollowed out. His face had gone ashen, his mouth working without sound, his authority collapsing into rubble before the entire school. Everything he had mocked, every word he had laughed through, now lay shattered under the weight of a truth he had been too arrogant to even consider. Principal Miller stood firm, his eyes steady on Evelyn. He had seen combat. He had seen commanders. But this was something else. This was history stepping out of the shadows into daylight, not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty. Evelyn, for her part, did not return the salute. She never had. Not once in her career had she returned a salute unless the moment demanded it. Her men knew this. They knew her silence spoke more than mimicry ever could. Instead, she gave the faintest nod, a gesture so slight most of the crowd might have missed it. But to the 200 men who had marched for her, it was everything. Permission, recognition, a conversation written in scars, battles, and unshakable loyalty. Their arms remained rigid, eyes locked on her. The tableau was so powerful it made the crowd shiver. In that instant, the students who had laughed yesterday realized the gravity of what they had done. They hadn't just mocked a boy. They had mocked a commander, a hero, a woman who had carried the weight of lives far heavier than their shallow jokes. Finally, Principal Miller's voice cut the silence, steady as a drum beat. For those of you who still don't understand what you're seeing, he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd, remember this. Greatness does not always announce itself. It doesn't always wear medals or uniforms or titles. Sometimes it wears a sweater, drives a station wagon, and raises a son quietly, without complaint. But make no mistake, he turned toward Evelyn, his voice reverent. Commander Evelyn Reed is Echo, and Echo is one of the finest warriors this nation has ever known. The words hit like a hammer. Students gasped. Teachers' eyes filled with tears. Even some of the seals, men carved from iron, felt the sting of pride and memory swelling in their chests. And through it all, Evelyn didn't flinch, didn't bow, didn't bask in the revelation. She stood still, calm, her expression unreadable. Her silence was her strength. Leo felt a hand brush his shoulder. He turned, and for the first time in years, his mother's eyes softened. No smile, no outward pride, but the message was clear. You see now. You understand. He nodded back, tears streaking freely down his face. This wasn't just vindication. It was transformation. The seals lowered their arms only when Evelyn's second nod dismissed them. Even that gesture was so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not trained to see it. Yet the formation obeyed instantly, their salute dissolving back into perfect stillness. For the students, the moment burned itself into memory like a brand. They would carry it forever. The day silence shattered arrogance. The day humility humbled pride. Mr. Harrison stumbled backward, finally finding his voice but losing every ounce of control. I didn't know. I didn't realize. Enough. Miller cut him off, his voice iron. There's no excuse for mocking what you don't understand. Harrison's lips trembled. His authority, his bluster, his classroom throne, all of it had collapsed. He was a man undone, stripped bare before those he once lorded over. And Evelyn, she didn't even look at him. That was the worst punishment of all. When the assembly finally broke, the story didn't spread, it detonated. Students texted, posted, shared. Clips of the march, the salute, and the glowing name echo went viral within minutes. By lunch, the legend had already outgrown the school walls. Leo walked through the halls with shoulders straighter than he ever knew he could hold. Not because others stared in awe, not because whispers followed him, but because he no longer needed their approval. He knew the truth, and now so did they. Evelyn walked beside him, her calm as unshakable as ever. The world had shifted, but she hadn't. She never would. For her, this wasn't about glory. It wasn't about revenge. It was about one thing only. Her son had spoken the truth, and the truth had stood up for itself. The quad slowly returned to motion, but the air still carried the weight of what had just unfolded. Students whispered in hushed voices, afraid to speak too loudly, as if doing so might break the fragile gravity of the moment. Teachers huddled together, their expressions dazed, searching for words that wouldn't come. The 200 SEALs remained at silent parade rest, the most immovable wall of discipline the school had ever seen. And Evelyn Reed. She turned from them as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if she had simply attended a routine parent meeting. Her hand rested briefly on Leo's shoulder, grounding him, steadying him, and then she began to walk toward the edge of the quad. Her presence radiated a paradox, utterly ordinary, yet impossibly commanding. For her, this wasn't spectacle. It wasn't about being seen. It was about correcting a lie. Mr. Harrison stood rooted where he had been left, his entire frame sagging under the unbearable weight of realization. His face was pale, his hands twitching at his sides as if searching for something to cling to. He looked smaller than Leo had ever seen him, a man crumpled by truth. It was Principal Miller who approached him. It wasn't another teacher. It was Evelyn. She stopped a few paces away, her eyes calm, unreadable. Harrison's throat bobbed as he tried to form words. "Commander, Mrs. Reed, I—" His voice cracked, broke, and started again. "I don't know what to say. What I said in that classroom, the way I mocked, it was unforgivable. I thought I understood. I thought." His words collapsed into nothing. For once there was no bluster, no laughter, no arrogant authority. Just a man hollowed out, face to face with his ignorance. Leo braced himself. He expected his mother to unleash something cutting, something sharp enough to slice the man where he stood. After all the humiliation, the ridicule, the pain, surely this was her chance to crush him with words. But Evelyn didn't seek vengeance. Her gaze was steady, her tone even almost soft. "My son told the truth." She let the words hang, clear, undeniable. "That is all that ever mattered." And then she turned away, laying a firm but gentle hand on Leo's shoulder, guiding him past Harrison without another glance. The silence she left behind was louder than any condemnation. That afternoon, the story spread like wildfire, not just through the school's social media channels, but across the entire community. Clips of the SEAL's synchronized arrival went viral. Still photos of Evelyn Reed, the unassuming woman in a gray sweater walking through ranks of living legends, became symbols of a new kind of strength. By evening, online forums buzzed with speculation. Veterans groups whispered her name, some recognizing her story, others piecing together fragments of rumors they had once heard. Parents at Northgate High traded messages of disbelief and awe. And within the school itself, a quiet transformation began. Mr. Harrison was never the same. He returned to his classroom the next day not as a broken man, but as a chastened one. He tore up his old lesson plans, the ones filled with loud tales of glory, of exaggerated heroics, of battles framed as entertainment. In their place, he wrote new lessons, lessons about humility, about sacrifice, about the unseen burdens carried by those who never ask for recognition. He spoke less, listened more, and every time he felt the urge to dominate a conversation with bluster, he remembered the silence of Evelyn Reed and how it had unraveled him more thoroughly than anger ever could. His greatest teaching tool became his own mistake. He would tell his students, "I once mocked what I didn't understand. Don't make the same mistake." And in that honesty, he found something he had never had before: respect. Leo, too, changed. He was the boy who lied about his mom anymore. He wasn't the quiet kid in row 9, easy to mock. He was the son of Echo, but he carried that truth with the same grace his mother carried herself. He didn't gloat. He didn't throw it in the faces of those who had laughed at him. He walked through the halls taller, steadier, not because of what they thought, but because he finally understood what he knew. A confidence rooted not in validation, but in truth. The school itself transformed. Principal Miller led the charge, establishing a new tradition, an annual Distinguished Veterans Day. Students would be encouraged to bring in stories of service members from their families, to learn and share the hidden legacies that, too often stayed invisible. By unanimous vote, the first and permanent guest of honor was Evelyn Reed. She accepted, but on her own terms. She never spoke about medals or missions. She never recounted tales meant to dazzle. Instead, she spoke of quiet strength, of the sacrifices no one sees, of the victories measured not in glory but in the lives that came home safely. Her voice was calm, her presence unshakable, her impact undeniable. And over time, her legend wove itself into the fabric of Northgate High, not as a spectacle, but as a parable, a story passed down to new freshmen each year, a reminder of the dangers of arrogance, the folly of assumptions, and the immeasurable power of quiet truth. In the end, Evelyn Reed didn't need to prove herself. She never had. Her silence proved enough. Her son's faith proved enough. And when 200 of the world's finest warriors saluted her in the center of a high school quad, the world had seen what Leo had always known. Strength doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand. That evening, long after the quad had emptied and the last whispers of the day had faded, Evelyn Reed sat alone in her kitchen. The house was quiet. Leo had finally drifted to sleep upstairs, exhausted by the flood of emotions that had crashed through him in the last 24 hours. His breathing, faintly audible through the ceiling, was steady now, peaceful. Evelyn sat at the table with a mug of untouched tea cooling between her palms. The world outside buzzed, news feeds already speculating about Commander Echo, veterans forums lighting up with recognition, neighbors whispering with a mix of pride and disbelief. But inside this house, silence ruled. And silence was where Evelyn wrestled with her ghosts. She hadn't spoken her call sign in years, hadn't thought she would again. The old phone she had used to summon the muster had been kept out of sight, sealed away, not because she feared exposure, but because she feared memory. And yet, when Leo's voice cracked under the weight of humiliation, when she saw the tremor in his hands as he told her how they laughed at him, there had been no hesitation. I understood. One word, spoken with the certainty of a commander giving orders. But beneath that certainty lived the cost. She closed her eyes now, and the years folded back. Sandstorms howling across desert skis. The burn of salt water grinding against her skin after 12 hours submerged. The weight of another human body slung across her shoulders, blood soaking into her uniform, the taste of dust and gunpowder in her mouth. Faces flashed through her memory, some she had saved, some she hadn't. And always, always, the silence after. The silence of rooms where laughter would never return. The silence of folded flags delivered to doorsteps. The silence she carried like a second skin. That was why they had called her Echo, not because she shouted, but because she carried the voices of the fallen with her. She was their reminder, their reverberation. And sometimes that weight pressed so heavily she wondered how she still walked upright. Upstairs, Leo stirred in his sleep. Evelyn listened for a moment, then exhaled slowly. He had been her reason to keep going when the battles ended, her anchor. The world wanted heroes in medals and speeches. She wanted only to be his mother. But tonight had reminded her of something she had nearly forgotten. The past was never truly buried. And when it rose in full force. The next morning, Evelyn found herself in her office again. The metal case sat where she had left it, closed now, but not forgotten. She hesitated, then unlatched it once more. Inside lay the artifacts of another life, a sidearm meticulously maintained despite years of disuse, a handful of insignias tucked into foam lining, a folded patch bearing a trident, and a small notebook bound in weathered leather. She picked up the notebook, thumbed its edge. Inside were pages of coded entries, mission logs written in shorthand only she and a handful of others would ever understand. She flipped to one at random. Operation Sentinel, Kandahar Province. 3 hostiles, 1 non-compliant civilian. Decision time, 7 seconds. Her handwriting was clean, efficient, stripped of emotion. But she remembered every detail. The eyes of the man she'd spared. The faces of the men who hadn't survived. The way the desert smelled when the air finally stilled. She closed the notebook and pressed it flat against her chest. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel it, the ache of those memories, the weight of carrying names and moments the world would never know. And then, as always, she placed the feeling back into the vault inside her. She couldn't afford to drown in it. Not now. Not with Leo watching her more closely than ever before. Later that day, Leo padded into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He stopped when he saw her sitting there, posture perfect, sipping her coffee. For a moment he didn't speak. He just studied her as if seeing her anew. "Mom," his voice was tentative. "Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn set her mug down. Her gaze met his steady, unflinching, but softened by something only he ever saw. "Because," she said, "it was never about me." "But they should know. Everyone should know." His voice carried both pride and the lingering need for the world to recognize what she was. She shook her head. "No, what matters is what you know, what you carry, not what they say." Leo frowned, struggling with the simplicity of her answer. For him, the revelation had been seismic, his entire life rewritten in a single morning. For her, it was just another truth folded neatly into silence. He wanted to push, wanted to ask about the missions, the scars, the names. But something in her eyes told him those questions carried weight he wasn't ready to bear. So he nodded instead, slowly. And in that nod, Evelyn felt the faintest flicker of relief. That night she dreamed, not of medals, not of salutes, but of running through endless corridors where voices echoed in the dark, men calling her name, men falling silent, always silent. She woke with her hand clenched around nothing, her breath steady but sharp. The dream faded, but the weight did not. It never did. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the faint outline of her reflection in the window. To the world she was Echo, the commander who had done the impossible. But in this house she was Evelyn Reed, a mother, a woman who carried too much and who chose again and again to bear it quietly. Leo would never fully know the burden she carried. And that was exactly how she wanted it. The days after the muster spread outward like concentric circles on still water, each ripple touching a new shore. Northgate High was no longer just a school. It was a story, a legend. Clips of the SEALs March had gone viral in less than 24 hours. By the end of the week, the video had amassed millions of views. News anchors speculated, veterans nodded knowingly, and ordinary citizens whispered to each other about the quiet mom in the gray sweater. But Evelyn Reed did not watch the news. She did not read the comments. She folded laundry with the same measured care as always. She walked Leo to school with the same unhurried stride. She bought groceries, exchanged polite greetings with neighbors, and lived as she always had, ordinary on the outside, untouchable within. She knew how fame worked. It rose quickly, burned hot, and consumed everything in its path. But silence endured. For the students of Northgate, the legend became a living thing. Freshmen whispered the story like a campfire tale. Sophomores repeated it to friends at other schools. Seniors, on the edge of adulthood, looked at Evelyn Reed and realized for the first time that greatness could walk unnoticed beside them every day. Some mocked less, some listened more. Leo walked the halls with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't boastful. He carried himself like someone who knew the weight of truth and didn't need to prove it. And that more than the spectacle itself. left a lasting mark. Principal Miller turned the event into curriculum. In history classes, students read not only about battles, but about the silence between them. They learned about unsung medics, about code talkers whose voices had been ignored, about women who had carried burdens in the shadows of wars that textbooks rarely mentioned. Every lesson carried a quiet echo of Evelyn Reed. Mr. Harrison taught differently now. He spoke less of loud victories and more of quiet resilience. He admitted his arrogance openly, telling his students, "Don't mistake silence for weakness. I once did, and I was wrong." The classroom that had once been a stage for his bluster became a place of humility. But beyond the school, the ripples grew larger. A local paper ran a front-page story titled, "Echo Walks Among Us. The commander who called a muster at Northgate." National outlets followed. Talk shows requested interviews. Military podcasts speculated about her record, piecing together fragments from redacted reports. A few veterans reached out privately, messages filled with respect and quiet gratitude. Evelyn declined them all. She answered no calls, granted no interviews, wrote no memoir. Her silence frustrated journalists, puzzled commentators, and fascinated strangers. But to those who truly understood, her refusal to step into the spotlight was the most fitting response of all. Echo had never been about the noise. One evening, as Evelyn prepared dinner, Leo scrolled through his phone at the kitchen table. He read a post aloud without realizing it. Some say she's the most decorated woman in SEAL history. Others say she doesn't even exist, just a code name for a unit. But if you were at Northgate, you know. He looked up. "Mom, they're saying all kinds of stuff about you. Some of it's crazy." Evelyn slid a pan onto the stove, the motion calm, precise. "Let them." But don't you care what they're saying? Don't you want to correct them?" She turned, meeting his eyes. "Leo, people will always build stories, some out of respect, some out of ignorance. My job isn't to chase them. My job is to make sure you know the truth. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a finality that ended the discussion. Leo nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand. Yet not everyone let it go so easily. One morning, as Evelyn walked across the grocery store parking lot, a man in a veteran's cap stopped her. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp with recognition. Echo, he said, his voice low, reverent. She paused, studied him. He raised his hand in a trembling salute. She did not return it. Instead, she gave the faintest nod. The man's eyes filled with tears. He whispered, "Thank you," and walked away. Evelyn carried her groceries home without another word. That night, as she stood at the kitchen sink, she caught her reflection in the window, plain sweater, tired eyes, ordinary woman. But behind that reflection, she saw shadows, the weight of fallen comrades, the salutes of men who had followed her through fire, the ghosts of missions etched into her bones. The world might shout about Echo for a time, but she knew the shouting would fade. And when it did, silence would remain. Silence and Leo. That was enough. The legend of Echo had rippled outward, but Evelyn Reed stayed still. The louder the world spoke her name, the quieter she became, because she knew the truth. Strength was never about how many heard you. It was about how you stood when no one was listening. Autumn gave way to winter, and with it came a new tradition at Northgate High. Principal Miller, with the support of the school board, announced an annual Distinguished Veterans Day. It would not be a parade of medals or a competition of stories. Instead, it would be a day for listening, a day to honor the hidden sacrifices in their own families, the quiet strength often overlooked. And for the first year, there was no debate about who would stand as the guest of honor. Commander Evelyn Reed. The gymnasium was full. Students filed into bleachers, their chatter muted by the memory of the muster. Parents sat in folding chairs along the floor. Local reporters tried discreetly to set up cameras, but Miller's warning glance made them reconsider. This wasn't a spectacle. It was a lesson. Leo sat in the front row, his heart pounding. He had heard his mother's voice 1,000 times in the kitchen, in the car, in the calm moments before sleep. But hearing her stand before the entire school was different. She walked to the podium with her usual unremarkable grace, plain blouse, hair tied back, posture steady. To most, she still looked like anyone's mother. But those who had seen the quad that day knew better. The room fell silent. She looked out at the faces, her gaze steady but never demanding. When she spoke, her voice was calm, even. "I'm not here to tell you war stories," she began. "If that's what you're expecting, you'll be disappointed." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd, but Evelyn's eyes held them steady. "I want to tell you about silence." The word hung in the air, unfamiliar yet undeniable. "Silence," she continued, "is where strength lives. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of shame, the silence of discipline, the silence of carrying something heavy without needing to announce it." Her eyes swept the crowd. Students leaned forward. Teachers sat straighter. "I've seen men and women who gave everything they had, not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was their duty. And when their stories ended, there were no cameras, no headlines, only silence." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "And I learned something in those years. True strength isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It doesn't boast. It doesn't demand attention. True strength can be invisible. It can be a mother raising her son. It can be a student refusing to laugh when everyone else does. It can be any of you choosing to stand firm when no one is watching." Leo felt his throat tighten. He had heard pieces of this before in the way she lived, but hearing it spoken aloud to everyone made it real in a way he hadn't expected. "Don't chase the noise," she said. "Don't mistake volume for truth. And never ever think that silence is weakness. Silence," her voice softened almost to a whisper, is where the strongest things live. She stepped back from the podium. That was all. No long speech, no dramatic ending. Just a few simple words that left the gym in profound, unshakable stillness. The applause that followed wasn't raucous. It wasn't the wild cheering of a pep rally. It was steady, respectful, rising like a wave, deep and resonant, not for spectacle, but for understanding. Leo stood with the others, clapping until his hands ached, his eyes burning with pride. For once, his mother had spoken not just to him, but through him, her lesson now etched into every heart in that room. In the months that followed, the tradition grew. Students began bringing their own family stories. A grandfather who never spoke of Korea, a mother who served as a medic, a brother who carried scars without complaint. And every year, Evelyn Reed sat in the front row, quiet, watchful. She spoke only once that first year. She never needed to again. Her silence became the lesson. Leo grew into it. The boy who had once flushed with shame in row 9 became a young man whose confidence didn't shout, didn't posture. He carried himself with the same calm strength he had seen in his mother. People still whispered about her. The legend of Echo lived on in forums, in articles, in rumors that came and went. But at Northgate High, she wasn't a legend. She was a presence, a reminder. And to Leo, she was simply Mom. Years later, long after the muster had faded into local lore, the story was still told to incoming students, not as gossip, not as spectacle, but as parable, about a teacher who mocked what he didn't understand, about a boy who spoke the truth, about a woman who walked into the quad in a gray sweater and taught an entire school the meaning of silence. The legend of Echo would always carry weight in military circles. But Evelyn Reed's true legacy was quieter, woven into the lives of ordinary students who learned that day what it meant to stand without needing to shout. And in that silence, her greatest victory lived on.